Have you ever believed in something so strongly until a single question made the whole world question you instead? It began with a simple curiosity, or perhaps a quiet challenge, whispered in a classroom inside Yale University, one of the most prestigious schools in the world, a place where ideas are dissected, languages are analyzed, and cultures are often placed under the microscope of Western intellect. On a cold afternoon in New Haven, a young man sat among rows of students from every continent. His name was Miguel Santos, a scholarship student from Cavite, Philippines. He was the only Filipino in his class, a seminar on world languages and cultural identity. That day, the professor, a well-known linguist with decades of research behind him, had just made an offhand remark that would soon travel far beyond the walls of Yale. He said, almost casually, "Tagalog, though interesting, is not a fully developed academic language. It's more conversational, more emotional than intellectual." The room went quiet. A few students nodded, some smirked, and others glanced at Miguel as if waiting for a reaction. He didn't speak at first, but something inside him, something old, proud, and deeply Filipino, stirred. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet ache, like watching someone misunderstand your family in front of strangers. For years, Miguel had heard variations of that same idea, that the Filipino language was beautiful but limited, poetic but primitive, expressive but unrefined. It was whispered by tourists, repeated in forums, printed in articles by people who had never once heard a Filipino grandmother pray or a Filipino soldier write home from the front lines. To them, Tagalog was a melody without meaning, a song without science. And yet, here it was again, echoing from one of the highest academic institutions in the world. A place Miguel had dreamed of since childhood. His parents had saved every peso they could so he could reach this seat, believing that Yale was where truth and wisdom lived. But in that moment, the truth felt different. It felt smaller. It felt as if the world's respect could vanish with a single dismissive comment. The professor's words weren't meant to offend. That was clear. He spoke as a man of logic, not of malice. But for Miguel, that distinction didn't matter. Because for millions of Filipinos, language is not just a tool. It is home. It carries the rhythm of prayers, the tenderness of lullabies, the pride of revolutions, and the pain of centuries. It is how a nation remembers itself. What if the world had forgotten that? What if the West, with all its libraries and theories, had missed the simplest truth, that the Filipino language, like the people who speak it, is alive because it feels deeply? Miguel looked around the room. The walls were lined with portraits of scholars, philosophers, and explorers, names that built empires and shaped how knowledge was defined. None of them looked like him. None of them had ever heard the word bayanihan. Then, quietly, he raised his hand. "Professor," he said, his voice steady but soft, "may I ask, what makes a language developed?" The professor smiled politely, assuming it was a theoretical question. "Well," he began, "a developed language is one that can express complex thought, philosophy, science, one that has structure beyond emotion." Miguel nodded slowly. "Then perhaps Tagalog is more developed than people think, because we use it to express something many languages can't: compassion, humility, faith, concepts that survive even when systems fail." A faint murmur passed through the class. The professor tilted his head, intrigued but skeptical. "That's poetic," he said, almost dismissively. "But poetry is not science." Miguel's eyes didn't waver. "But what if poetry is our science?" There was silence, the kind that presses against the air, that makes even the clock hesitate to tick. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in the professor. Not yet. but in the young man from the islands who realized that even in the halls of the world's most powerful schools, he had the right to defend his language. That night, Miguel walked across the empty campus, the winter air biting against his skin. The words from class replayed in his mind. Not a fully developed language. He whispered it again and again, not in anger, but in reflection. Because maybe this was his purpose, not to argue, but to show, not to fight for validation, but to reveal something the West had forgotten, that intellect without empathy is incomplete. He didn't know then that this single moment, one quiet exchange between a professor and a Filipino student, would soon spark a global conversation about what it truly means to be developed. And that in the coming months, even the professor himself would stand before cameras and say words no one expected to hear. Tagalog taught me what intelligence without heart can never explain. But that would come later. For now, all he could do was walk. One student, one language, one heartbeat, carrying the weight of a nation that the world had underestimated for far too long. Long before that day at Yale, long before anyone had heard his name, Miguel Santos was just a boy from Cavite, the son of a tricycle driver and a schoolteacher who believed education could lift anything, even poverty. Their home was small, but filled with books, laughter, and the gentle sound of prayers said before every meal. His mother would whisper in Tagalog, "Anak, ang edukasyon ay kayamanan na hindi mananakaw." Education is the one treasure no one can steal. Those words became the melody of his life. But Cavite was not an easy place to grow up for a dreamer. The rain would flood their street every monsoon season, and sometimes Miguel had to wade through knee-deep water just to reach school. There were nights when the lights went out, and he studied by candlelight while the distant sound of karaoke drifted through the neighborhood. To the world, the Philippines was a postcard of beaches and smiles. But for Miguel, it was also sacrifice, the quiet heroism of millions of parents working abroad, the hunger hidden behind humble laughter, the resilience disguised as cheerfulness. When he received the scholarship to Yale, his whole barangay celebrated. It was as if one of their own had been chosen to carry the flag of the islands into the heart of the Western world. His father cried silently that night. "Make them see us," he said. "Not just our labor, our worth." Miguel promised he would. But the moment he arrived in America, he realized that promise would not be easy to keep. The first time he spoke Tagalog in the cafeteria, a student from another country smiled and said, "Oh, that sounds cute." Cute. The word cut deeper than he expected. Because it was said with kindness, but it carried the same assumption, that Tagalog was playful, not powerful, melodic, but not meaningful. In his first semester, Miguel joined debates, wrote essays, and tried to prove that a boy from the tropics could stand shoulder to shoulder with the sons and daughters of senators and CEOs. But beneath every success was a quiet pressure to sound Western enough, to be articulate enough, to be almost equal. It wasn't Yale's fault. It was the invisible gravity of history, pulling him to believe that intellect had an accent, and that accent wasn't his. He struggled silently. Some nights he'd call home and tell his mother everything was fine. But after hanging up, he would stare at his reflection, asking himself if he still belonged to the world he left behind, or the one he was now trying to survive in. He missed jeepneys, the smell of rain on Manila asphalt, and the way strangers would smile back on the street for no reason. America was safe, efficient, modern, but it was also lonely. There was one night in his sophomore year that changed everything. He had just finished writing a paper on linguistic identity when he overheard two classmates in the library. One said, "It's crazy how many Filipinos speak perfect English. They don't even have their own real language, right?" The other laughed, agreeing. Miguel froze. He wanted to correct them, to explain, but his throat closed up. For the first time, he felt not just misunderstood, but erased. That night, he walked aimlessly around campus, passing through the darkened courtyard where the flags of many nations hung. The Philippine flag fluttered faintly under a dim light. He stood there for a long time, wondering if anyone really saw it. Days turned into weeks, and something began to shift inside him. He started reading not just textbooks, but Filipino literature. Balagtas, Nick Joaquin, Lualhati Bautista. He found himself rediscovering the language he had once taken for granted. The words felt heavier now, wiser. Each syllable carried stories that no Western theory could define. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done testing him. During the following semester, he applied to assist in a research project on language and emotion. When he proposed to include Tagalog as one of the study's focal points, his request was politely denied. "There isn't enough academic material to analyze," the professor said. Miguel wanted to protest, but he bit his tongue. He knew the system. Data decides what matters, not dignity. It was then that he made a decision that would change everything. He would write his thesis about the cognitive depth of Tagalog, not as a rebellion, but as a revelation. He wanted to show that what the world called emotion was in fact a form of intelligence too deep to measure by Western standards. Still, doubt haunted him. Who would take him seriously? A Filipino student talking about compassion as science? Even his classmates warned him, "It's risky, professors won't buy it." But Miguel pressed on, because for him, this wasn't about grades anymore. It was about voice. The voice of a people who had always spoken softly but felt profoundly. And so, when that day in class arrived, the day the professor questioned the legitimacy of Tagalog, Miguel wasn't just a student defending a language. He was a son defending his mother's prayers, his father's dream, and the quiet strength of millions who had been told their softness was weakness. He didn't know it yet, but the confrontation that began with a single question would ignite something far larger. Not just in him, but across oceans. It would lead to a discovery that even Yale's oldest scholars could not ignore. When news broke out that a Yale professor had dismissed a Filipino language as underdeveloped, it spread faster than anyone expected. It started with a few posts on social media. A student had recorded a short clip of Miguel's exchange in class and uploaded it with the caption, "He asked one question that silenced the room." Within days, that question echoed across thousands of screens, carried by Filipinos living everywhere, from Dubai to Toronto, from Cebu to California. It was no longer just about a classroom debate. It was about identity. But Miguel hadn't meant to go viral. In fact, when the story began gaining traction, he panicked. Reporters wanted interviews. Online forums debated whether Tagalog, or any non-Western language, could truly hold intellectual weight. Some mocked him. Others praised him. But what struck him most was the wave of messages from Filipinos around the world. "You made us proud. You spoke what we've always wanted to say. Thank you for reminding them we exist." Amid the noise, Miguel's professor called him to his office. The man looked different now, not arrogant, just curious. "Miguel," he said slowly, "the world seems very interested in what you said. Perhaps we can explore this academically. Would you be willing to write a paper with me? To prove or disprove your claim?" Miguel hesitated. It wasn't about winning an argument anymore, but he agreed. Together they decided to research how Tagalog expresses emotional intelligence, empathy, humility, shared suffering, through linguistic patterns. For months, Miguel analyzed Filipino proverbs, love letters from wartime, and even church homilies. The professor analyzed the data through Western linguistic models, but time and again, The numbers failed to capture what the words truly meant. One night, the professor stared at a transcript of a Filipino poem translated into English. "The meaning shifts," he said, frustrated. "The structure is correct, but the soul disappears." Miguel smiled softly. "Because in Tagalog, meaning doesn't live in grammar. It lives in connection." That was the moment something changed. The professor, for the first time, seemed humbled. "Then maybe," he whispered, "we've been studying languages all wrong." Yet even with this revelation, Miguel felt something missing. He could analyze Tagalog, quote poets, write academic arguments, but he couldn't feel it from inside Yale's walls. He realized he had been away too long. To understand his language, he needed to return to where it was born, to listen not to scholars, but to the people who lived it every day. That summer, Miguel flew back to the Philippines. It had been 4 years since he left. As the plane descended over Manila Bay, the orange sun melted into the water, painting the skyline in gold. The moment he stepped out of the airport, the humid air embraced him like a memory that had been waiting. Jeepneys honked. Vendors called out in Tagalog. And for the first time in years, he didn't have to translate anything in his mind. Everything just made sense. He traveled across the islands, from Cavite to Pampanga, from Iloilo to Cebu, meeting teachers, priests, fishermen, and street vendors. He asked them what certain words meant to them. He discovered that every region had its own version of love, respect, and sacrifice, expressed not through theory, but through tone, gesture, and silence. In a small village in Bataan, he met a woman named Ailing Rosa, who lost her son to a typhoon years ago. When he asked her how she found the strength to keep going, she simply said, "Nasa puso ng tao ang pag-asa." Hope lives in the human heart. She didn't need psychology or philosophy to define it. Her voice carried centuries of resilience, distilled into one sentence. Miguel recorded these voices, these words. When he returned to Yale, he presented them to his professor. The man listened carefully, headphones pressed to his ears. He heard laughter, prayers, street sounds, and lullabies. Then, tears welled up in his eyes, a scholar of languages undone by the music of one he had dismissed. "Miguel," he said softly, "you were right. Tagalog isn't emotional because it lacks structure. It's emotional because it carries humanity." The professor insisted that Miguel present their findings at the upcoming World Linguistics Conference, where experts from around the world would attend. Miguel was nervous. After all, who was he to stand before such names? But the professor placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes it takes a voice from outside the system to remind us what truth sounds like. When the day came, Miguel stood at the podium, facing an audience of renowned linguists. He began not with statistics, but with a question, the same one that started it all. What makes a language developed? He paused. If it is the ability to speak of love, faith, and resilience, even when words fail, then Tagalog has always been developed. Perhaps more than any of us ever realized. A hush fell over the hall. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, unexpectedly, people began to clap, first softly, then rising into a standing ovation. The moment was not about a victory. It was about recognition. The West had listened, truly listened, to a voice from the islands. Outside the hall, the press waited. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked for sound bites. But Miguel only said one line before walking away. "I didn't defend a language today. I defended the soul of a people." In the months that followed his presentation, Miguel became a quiet symbol of pride for Filipinos everywhere. Universities invited him to speak, journalists wrote about his story, and strangers sent letters thanking him for reminding the world of the dignity within their words. Yet despite the attention, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt more like a messenger. carrying home something that was never lost, only forgotten. He returned once more to the Philippines, not for research, not for applause, but for peace. He wanted to live the language, not just study it. So he turned down several offers abroad and chose to teach for a year at a small public school in Bulacan. It was there, among children who walked miles to class, that he began to see what intelligence truly meant. Every morning, he would hear students reciting prayers before lessons began. They said them in unison, voices uneven but sincere. Panginoon, salamat po sa panibagong araw. Lord, thank you for another day. Those words held a depth no theory could measure. These children, with nothing but notebooks and determination, carried more hope than many of the scholars he had met abroad. One day, while teaching literature, Miguel asked his class what their favorite Tagalog word was. The answers came quickly: pag-asa, bayanihan, malasakit, utang na loob. But one boy at the back raised his hand shyly and said, "Sir, my favorite word is tatag, strength." He explained that his father was a construction worker overseas, and his mother sold vegetables to keep them afloat. Every time things get hard, I think of tatag, because that's what it means to be Filipino, right? You keep standing. Miguel smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. Yes, that was it. Tatag. A word that carried both pain and perseverance, the same duality that had always defined his people. Outside the classroom, he joined community gatherings and church processions. He watched as neighbors carried each other's burdens, literally. When a typhoon hit nearby towns, families shared what little they had. Nobody asked who was rich or poor. They simply acted. Bayanihan was not a concept to them. It was instinct. One night, as the electricity flickered after a storm, Miguel sat with the villagers under a single kerosene lamp. Rain poured hard on the tin roof, but laughter filled the air. A grandmother began telling old folk tales in Tagalog, her words rolling like poetry. The children listened with wide eyes, the elders nodded, and Miguel found himself quietly crying. Because in that moment he realized this was the Philippines. Not the poverty, not the statistics, but the heartbeat that refused to stop. He thought of Yale, of the cold classrooms and polished marble halls, and wondered if intellect without warmth could ever reach this kind of wisdom. The Philippines had something no institution could replicate: the courage to stay soft in a hard world. Weeks later, Miguel received an email from his professor in New Haven. Attached was a paper they had co-authored, now accepted for publication in a leading linguistic journal. The title read, "The Language of Empathy, a Study of Tagalog's Cognitive Depth." At the end of the paper, the professor had written a single line: "Dedicated to the Filipino people, who taught me that to feel deeply is to think profoundly." Miguel stared at those words for a long time. He thought of his parents, of Cavite, of the boy who once studied by candlelight. He remembered the ache of hearing his language dismissed, and the quiet triumph of hearing it honored. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped outside, feeling the humid air touch his skin. The sky was painted pink and gold, the kind of sunset that looked almost too beautiful to be real. In the distance, church bells rang. Children ran barefoot through puddles, shouting, laughing, living. And he whispered to himself, "This is what they'll never understand until they come here." That evening, he joined a community feeding program organized by the local parish. As he handed bowls of rice and soup to children, one little girl tugged at his sleeve and said, "Kuya, thank you." Her smile was small, but her eyes were pure light. In that simple exchange, Miguel felt everything he had ever tried to prove: compassion, intellect, grace, merge into one. He finally understood. The strength of the Filipino wasn't in grand speeches or global recognition. It was in the everyday acts of love that asked for nothing in return. In a country that had been colonized, criticized, and underestimated for centuries, people still found ways to give and to smile while doing it. That night, lying on a thin mattress under the hum of an electric fan, Miguel wrote one final note in his journal. They call Tagalog emotional because it speaks from the heart. But maybe that's what the world needs now, a language that still remembers how to feel. And somewhere across the ocean, in a university that once questioned that very idea, an old professor read the same words in translation and quietly wept. Months passed. The waves of attention began to calm, but something deeper remained, a quiet respect that crossed borders. Universities in Europe and the United States began citing the paper he co-wrote with his professor. Linguists started re-examining the definition of a developed language. Even more remarkable, some Western schools added Tagalog and other Southeast Asian languages to their elective programs, recognizing them not as curiosities, but as windows into emotional intelligence. Miguel never sought fame, yet his journey had become a mirror through which the world saw the Filipino soul, resilient, faithful, endlessly kind. He had shown that intelligence was not only what the mind could build, but what the heart could sustain. He now lectured occasionally, not in grand auditoriums, but in community halls, online seminars, and small gatherings. He spoke not as an expert, but as a witness. Language, he would say, isn't just what we speak. It's how we care. It's how we forgive. It's how we keep each other alive. His words were simple, but they resonated. Audiences from across continents listened, often in silence, realizing that the Philippines had something they had lost, the art of connecting without pretense. One day, Miguel received an invitation from Yale to return as a guest speaker. The same classroom, the same campus, the same winter chill. As he walked through the courtyard, now older and calmer, he felt no bitterness, only gratitude. When he entered the lecture hall, he found his old professor seated among the students. The man stood and greeted him with a warm handshake. "Welcome home, Miguel," he said. The words lingered. Home. For years, Miguel had tried to define that word, to fit into places that never quite fit him. But now he realized home wasn't a place. It was a language. It was belonging without needing to explain yourself. When he spoke to the class, he began not with a theory, but a story. He told them about the mother in Bataan who said, "Hope lives in the human heart," about the boy who defined strength as tatag, about the community that fed strangers during storms. And then he paused, letting the silence fill the room just as it had years ago. "I came here once to prove that my language mattered," he said quietly. "Now I know. It's not just Tagalog that matters. It's what it teaches us about being human." When he finished, the students applauded. Not the thunderous applause of admiration, but the kind that comes from respect, slow, sincere, and filled with thought. The professor, his eyes misted with pride, approached the podium. "Miguel," he said softly, "you were my student once, but today I am yours." That moment was more than reconciliation. It was a turning point, a rare acknowledgement that wisdom flows both ways. The colonizer and the colonized, the teacher and the student, the West and the East, no longer divided by pride, but united by humility. Miguel returned to the Philippines soon after. He chose not to build a career abroad, but to stay and teach, believing that the world didn't need another scholar. It needed more bridges. His lectures in Manila became small celebrations of what it meant to be Filipino, to feel deeply, to rise after every fall, and to speak softly, yet carry the power to move nations. in one of his final talks. Held in a public plaza beneath the fading sunset, Miguel addressed a crowd of young Filipinos. "You are told," he said, "that your country is small, that your language is simple, that your faith is naive. But look around you. Our simplicity is strength, our faith is light, and our language, our Tagalog, carries the oldest wisdom of all, to love even when the world forgets how." People cried quietly, not out of sadness, but because something inside them remembered. And so, when the camera crews and journalists later asked him what he wanted the world to learn from his story, he smiled and answered, "That progress without compassion is empty. The Philippines taught me that the truest form of intelligence is kindness." In the years that followed, Miguel's life became less public, but his story lived on, in classrooms, in essays, in conversations whispered across the diaspora. He never wrote another viral paper, never sought another headline. Yet his name became something gentler, a symbol of a generation that dared to speak softly and still be heard. Today, if you walk through certain universities abroad, you might hear Tagalog words written on the walls of language centers: Pag-asa, Malasakit, Tatag. Beneath them, a small plaque reads, "Inspired by the work of Miguel Santos, Yale University, 2025. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest voice can echo the loudest truth. And if you listen closely, beyond the applause, beyond the languages and theories, you might still hear the gentle rhythm of a nation speaking through him, a nation that has suffered, yet still sings, a people who have been doubted, yet still believe, and a language born of pain, preserved by faith, carried by love, that finally made the world stop, listen, and say, 'The Philippines has taught us what humanity sounds like.'"